Al Capone spotted the homeless girl singing and headed straight for her. His heavy footsteps echoed on the frozen pavement. Little Betty pressed herself against the brick wall, terrified. His men flanked him, ready for trouble. The street went dead silent. But what happened next on that December night in 1931 would become the most talked about story in Chicago. This is a dramatized account rooted in how things worked back then. A Chicago story from an era when the city's streets belonged to men like Capone. But sometimes, even the most feared men are stopped by something they never expected to hear. December 3rd, 1931, 9:40 p.m. The temperature had dropped to 12 degrees, and the wind was cutting through Chicago's south side like a blade. Most decent folks had found somewhere warm to wait out the night, but not everyone had that luxury. Betty Novak was 12 years old, though the streets had aged her well beyond her years. Just 6 weeks earlier, she'd been a different child entirely. She'd lived in a small apartment above Kowalski's bakery with her mother, Anna, who worked as a seamstress for wealthy families on the north side. Anna Novak had been the kind of mother who sang lullabies in Czech, who saved pennies for months to buy Betty a new dress for Easter, who never missed a Sunday service at St. Agnes Cathedral. She taught Betty to sing in that little apartment, their voices harmonizing as Anna mended clothes by lamplight. "Music is prayer made beautiful," Anna would say, her fingers working needle and thread while Betty practiced hymns. "When we sing to God, we become angels for just a moment." Then came the pneumonia. It started as a simple cough in late October, but by November, Anna was bedridden and struggling to breathe. The doctor wanted $25, money they didn't have. Anna died on November 18th, holding Betty's hand, whispering the words to Amazing Grace with her final breath. The landlord gave Betty 3 days to clear out. When she couldn't pay the rent, he threw her few belongings onto State Street like garbage. Her mother's sewing machine, their small radio, the sheet music they'd collected, all of it scattered on the sidewalk for scavengers to pick through. That December 3rd had been particularly brutal for Betty. She'd woken before dawn in the doorway of Murphy's hardware store, her body stiff and aching from sleeping on concrete. The newspaper she'd wrapped around her feet had turned soggy from melted snow, her stomach cramped with hunger. She hadn't eaten since the day before, when a kind woman at the soup kitchen had slipped her an extra roll. She'd spent the morning walking, trying to keep warm, trying to stay invisible. Shop owners chased her away from their doorways. Policemen told her to move along. Even the other homeless people avoided her. A young girl alone was more burden than help in their world of scarce resources and harsh survival. By afternoon, she'd earned 11 cents singing outside the Woolworths on Madison Street. But the manager had eventually come out and shooed her away, saying she was disturbing customers. The coins felt heavy in her pocket, but they wouldn't buy much. Maybe a cup of coffee and a stale donut, if she could find someone willing to serve a dirty child. As evening approached and the temperature dropped, Betty had faced a choice that no 12-year-old should have to make. She could find somewhere to hide for the night, curl up and try to survive until morning. Or she could sing one more time, hoping for enough coins to buy something warm, something that might keep her alive another day. The corner of 22nd and State had seemed as good as any. She'd sung there before, and sometimes people had been generous. The streetlight provided a small circle of safety in the darkness, and the brick wall of the bakery blocked some of the wind. Now Betty stood on that corner, her thin coat buttoned tight against the wind. Her shoes had holes that she'd stuffed with newspaper that morning, but the paper was wet now and useless. Her breath came out in white puffs as she sang, her voice carrying across the empty street. Amazing Grace, how sweet the sound! She wasn't performing for money, not really. The tin cup at her feet held those 11 cents from earlier, but that wasn't why she sang. She sang because it was the last connection she had to her mother. She sang because the music made her feel less alone. She sang because it was all she had left of the life she'd known before everything fell apart. Her voice was clear and true, trained by years of singing with Anna in their little apartment. Even in her fear, even with her stomach empty and her fingers numb, Betty sang like an angel. The hymn rose and fell with a purity that seemed to cut through the harsh December air. She remembered her mother's words about music being prayer made beautiful, and she sang as if her life depended on it, because maybe it did. The black Cadillac pulled up to the curb with barely a whisper, its engine purring like a well-fed cat. The car itself was a statement, polished to mirror brightness despite the dirty snow and salt that covered every other vehicle in Chicago. 3 men stepped out onto the frozen sidewalk, their expensive overcoats and polished shoes marking them as different from the neighborhood regulars. The few people still on the street, that late at night, began to melt away into shadows. A woman walking her small dog suddenly decided to cross to the other side. 2 young men who'd been sharing a cigarette near the barber shop stubbed it out and disappeared into an alley. Even the stray cats that usually prowled the garbage cans seemed to sense danger and vanished. This was how it always happened when Al Capone appeared. The neighborhood emptied, not because of any threat he'd made, but because everyone understood the rules. When powerful men conducted business, smart people made themselves invisible. Al Capone was in the middle of the group, his broad frame unmistakable even in the dim streetlight. At 32, he carried himself with the confidence of a man who owned half of Chicago, but tonight there was something different about his posture. His shoulders sagged slightly, as if carrying invisible weight. The meeting they'd just left had been particularly tedious. Hours of territorial disputes and revenue calculations that left him feeling older than his years. To his left stood Frank Rio, his bodyguard and enforcer, a man whose loyalty to Capone was absolute. Rio's eyes constantly scanned the street, cataloging potential threats, escape routes, anything that might endanger his boss. To Capone's right was Tony Accardo, barely 25, but already feared throughout the South Side for his cold efficiency. They'd been heading to another late meeting at Colosimo's, discussing the ongoing territorial disputes with the Irish gangs and revenue streams from their network of speakeasies. Business as usual for Chicago's most powerful crime boss. The kind of meeting where decisions were made that would affect thousands of lives across the city, where fortunes were won and lost with a handshake or a nod. But as they walked down State Street, their footsteps echoing off the empty storefronts, Capone heard something that made him slow his pace. Something that cut through the wind and the distant sound of traffic and the hum of the city that never truly slept. A young voice, singing in the darkness, pure and heartbreaking and impossibly beautiful. The melody reached him before he could see its source, and for a moment, Al Capone forgot about business entirely. The sound reminded him of something from long ago. His mother singing while she cooked, his sister practicing scales at their old piano in Brooklyn. It was the sound of innocence in a world that had forgotten what innocence looked like. Betty was halfway through the second verse when she saw them approaching, the 3 dark figures moving with purpose down the empty street. Her voice faltered for just a moment as her eyes met Capone's. Even at 12, she knew who he was. Everyone in Chicago knew that face, those calculating eyes, that deliberate way of walking that said he feared nothing and no one. Stories about Al Capone were whispered in her neighborhood like cautionary tales, how he'd started as muscle for Johnny Torrio and built an empire on bootleg liquor and intimidation, how he'd survived assassination attempts and federal investigations, how men twice his size would step aside when he walked down the street, how police officers would suddenly find urgent business elsewhere when his black Cadillac appeared. Fear shot through her small body like electricity. She pressed herself against the brick wall of the closed bakery, her tin cup clutched to her chest, wondering if she'd somehow broken one of his rules just by existing on this corner. Had she chosen the wrong street? Was this territory that belonged to someone else? In her world, such mistakes could be fatal. For a moment that seemed to stretch forever, Al Capone stood 15 feet away from Betty, studying her with the same careful attention he usually reserved for business rivals and federal agents. His men flanked him, their hands resting casually inside their coats where their guns waited. The street had emptied completely now. Even the windows of nearby apartments seemed to have gone dark, as if the entire neighborhood was holding its breath. Betty's voice had stopped completely. She clutched her tin cup to her chest, her eyes wide with terror, expecting violence from Chicago's most dangerous man. She thought about running, but her legs wouldn't move. She thought about screaming, but who would come to help a homeless girl against Al Capone? She thought about begging for mercy, but her voice had abandoned her completely. All she could do was stare at this man whose reputation preceded him like thunder before lightning, whose very presence had emptied the street in seconds. But Capone wasn't looking at her with the cold calculation his enemies knew so well. Instead, there was something almost sad in his expression, a weariness that seemed to age him beyond his 32 years. He was tired. Tired of the constant vigilance. Tired of seeing people scatter in fear whenever he appeared. Tired of being the monster that parents used to frighten their children into good behavior. For just a moment, standing on that frozen street corner, Al Capone felt the weight of every decision he'd made, every bridge he'd burned, every line he'd crossed on his way to the top. He saw himself reflected in this child's terrified eyes, and he didn't like what he saw. When he spoke, his voice was surprisingly gentle, with just a trace of the Brooklyn accent he'd never quite lost. The words came out softer than he'd intended, almost hesitant. "Don't stop singing, kid." Betty stared at him, unable to process what she'd heard. In her 12 years of life, no adult had ever asked her to keep singing. Usually, they told her to be quiet, to stop making noise, to mind her own business and move along. "Go on," Capone said, his breath visible in the cold air. "I was enjoying it. Haven't heard that song in a long time." There was something in his voice that wasn't quite a request, but wasn't quite a command either. It was almost like he was asking for a favor, though Betty couldn't imagine what someone like Al Capone could possibly want from someone like her. Frank Rio and Tony Accardo exchanged glances, but said nothing. They'd learned long ago not to question their boss's impulses, no matter how unexpected they might be. But this was different from anything they'd witnessed before. Their boss, the man who commanded fear and respect across Chicago, was standing on a frozen street corner, asking a homeless child to sing for him. Betty's voice came back in a whisper at first, trembling with fear and cold and exhaustion. But as she continued, something in Capone's expression encouraged her. His face had softened in a way that transformed him completely. The hard edges that made him feared across the city seemed to melt away as he listened, replaced by something that looked almost like longing. "I once was lost, but now am found." As Betty's voice grew stronger, Al Capone did something that would shock everyone who witnessed it. He closed his eyes and let the music wash over him, and for a moment, he wasn't Chicago's crime boss. He wasn't Scarface Al, or the man who'd built an empire on violence and intimidation. He was just Alphonse Capone from Brooklyn, remembering his mother singing Italian hymns while she cooked Sunday dinner for her 9 children, remembering a time when music meant comfort instead of pain, when voices raised in song meant family instead of fear. When Betty reached the chorus again, something extraordinary happened. Al Capone began to hum along, so softly at first that only she could hear it. Then with more confidence as his memory found the melody that had been buried under years of gunfire and boardroom negotiations and the constant weight of command. "Was blind, but now I see." His deep, gravelly voice provided a bass harmony to her clear soprano. The contrast was startling. Chicago's most feared criminal boss, harmonizing with a homeless 12-year-old girl on a frozen street corner. But it worked. Their voices blended in a way that seemed to warm the air around them, creating something beautiful in the middle of December's cruelty. Frank Rio stood frozen, watching his boss sing hymns with a street child. In all his years protecting Capone, through shootouts and raids and tense negotiations with rival gangs, he'd never seen anything like this. Tony Accardo's usual stone-faced expression had given way to something resembling wonder, as if he was witnessing a miracle he didn't quite understand. As they sang together, other people began to emerge from doorways and alleys. A night shift worker, heading home from the steel mill, drawn by the unexpected sound of music on a night when most sensible people stayed indoors. An elderly man walking his small dog despite the cold, stopping when he heard voices raised in harmony. A young couple hurrying to catch the late streetcar, slowing their pace as they realized what they were witnessing. They all stopped and listened, drawn by something they couldn't quite name. Betty's fear had evaporated completely now. She was no longer singing to a dangerous mobster. She was singing with someone who understood music, who appreciated the beauty of the hymn, whose voice complemented hers in ways that reminded her of singing with her mother in their little apartment above the bakery. For those few minutes, Al Capone wasn't Chicago's crime boss. He was just a man with a surprisingly good voice, sharing a song on a cold night with a child who needed someone to care whether she lived or died. Through many dangers, toils, and snares, I have already come. Their voices rose together, carrying across the empty street, turning a corner known for violence and fear into something that felt almost holy. The melody seemed to take on a life of its own, echoing off the brick buildings and empty storefronts, transforming the harsh urban landscape into something softer, more forgiving. Something magical began to happen on that corner of 22nd and State Street. The small crowd that had gathered wasn't running away in fear. They were staying, listening. Some began to hum along, their voices adding layers to the impromptu choir that had formed around a homeless girl and a crime boss. Frank Rio, seeing his boss's contentment, began to keep rhythm by gently clapping his gloved hands together. The sound echoed off the brick buildings, steady as a heartbeat. Tony Accardo, not to be outdone, started tapping his foot on the frozen pavement, adding a subtle percussion that grounded the melody. An old Italian woman named Maria Benedetto, who owned the corner grocery store, came out with a heavy wool shawl and draped it around Betty's shoulders without saying a word. She whispered something in Italian that sounded like a prayer and pressed a warm dinner roll into Betty's frozen hand. A young father lifted his small son onto his shoulders so the boy could see what was happening. The child began to clap, along with the makeshift rhythm section that Capone's men had become, his small hands keeping perfect time. Even Officer Patrick McKenna, a beat cop who would normally scatter any crowd involving Al Capone, stood at a respectful distance and listened. This wasn't business. This wasn't territory. This wasn't the kind of meeting that ended with chalk outlines and newspaper headlines. This was just music on a cold night, and somehow that made it sacred. For perhaps the first time in years, a Chicago street corner felt safe when Al Capone was there. People smiled at each other. Strangers nodded in recognition of the shared moment. Children weren't hurried away from the scene. When they finished the hymn, the silence that followed wasn't empty. It was full of the connection between unlikely voices, full of the warmth that music can create even in the coldest places, full of the understanding that something extraordinary had just occurred. When the song ended, nobody moved for several long seconds. The spell wasn't broken. It deepened into something more substantial, more lasting. Al Capone reached into his coat pocket, and for a split second, the crowd tensed. Old habits died hard, even in moments of beauty. But he pulled out a thick roll of bills, more money than most of these people had ever seen in one place. He peeled off several 20s and placed them gently in Betty's tin cup, but his eyes never left her face. The sound of the bills hitting the few coins already there was unnaturally loud in the quiet street. Betty stared down at more money than her mother had earned in 3 months of sewing, more money than she'd seen in her entire 12 years of life. "You got somewhere to sleep tonight, kid?" Betty shook her head, afraid to lie to him. "No, sir. I've been staying in different places, doorways mostly. Sometimes the Mission if they got room." "What about family? Somebody looking after you?" "My mama died last month," Betty said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Pneumonia. There ain't nobody else." Something shifted in Capone's expression, a shadow of pain that crossed his features like a cloud passing over the moon. He knelt down so he was at Betty's eye level, his expensive coat touching the dirty sidewalk, without any regard for the stains it would leave. When he spoke again, his voice was gentler than anyone had ever heard it, soft enough that only Betty could make out the words. "What's your name, sweetheart?" "Betty Novak, sir." "Betty?" he repeated, as if testing how it sounded. "That's a beautiful name. My mother, she would have liked you, Betty. She always said the angels had the prettiest voices." He was quiet for a moment, studying her face in the dim streetlight. Betty could see something working behind his eyes, some decision being made. "You know what, Betty? I think you and I are going to be friends." He turned to Tony Accardo. "Take her to Mrs. O'Malley's boarding house on Halstead. Tell her Al sent her personally. Make sure she gets the best room they have, and 3 good meals a day. Pay them for 6 months up front." But then, Capone did something else, something that surprised even his own men. He reached into his vest pocket and pulled out a small leather notebook and a gold pen that caught the streetlight. "Betty, I want you to write down your full name and today's date right here," he said, tearing out a clean page. "This is going to be our contract. You keep singing. No matter what happens, you keep that beautiful voice working. And I'll make sure you have what you need. Deal?" Betty's hands were shaking as she wrote her name in careful, childish letters. The pen felt heavy and important in her small fingers. "Deal, Mr. Capone." "Just Al," he said with a smile that transformed his face completely. "Friends call me Al." As Tony Accardo gently took Betty's arm to lead her to the waiting car, she could feel the eyes of the small crowd following her. But there was no judgment in those looks, only a kind of wonder at what they'd witnessed. The old Italian woman pressed another roll into her free hand. The young father nodded respectfully as she passed. Even Officer McKenna touched the brim of his cap in a small salute. Al Capone stood and watched as his car pulled away with Betty safely inside. The crowd began to disperse slowly, reluctant to let the moment end completely. But they carried something with them, a story they would tell for the rest of their lives about the night when Chicago's most dangerous man chose kindness over fear. Frank Rio approached his boss, who was still staring after the disappearing taillights. "That was something, Al," he said quietly. Capone nodded, still lost in thought. "Yeah, Frank, that was something." What happened between Al Capone and Betty Novak over the next several years became one of Chicago's most closely guarded secrets. True to his word, Capone made sure Betty wanted for nothing. But his help went far beyond just room and board. Every few weeks, Tony Accardo would appear at Mrs. O'Malley's boarding house with an envelope. Sometimes it contained money for clothes or school supplies. Sometimes it held tickets to concerts at Orchestra Hall, where Betty could hear professional musicians perform. Once, it contained the address of a music teacher who'd been paid a year in advance to give Betty proper voice lessons. But the most precious deliveries were the personal notes from Al himself. Written in his surprisingly elegant handwriting, they asked about her progress in school, her health, her dreams for the future. He signed them all, "Your friend, Al," and sometimes included little jokes or stories that made Betty smile for days. Mrs. O'Malley, a shrewd Irish woman who'd seen everything the South Side had to offer, never asked questions about Betty's mysterious benefactor. She simply made sure the girl had the best care possible and occasionally remarked that Betty must have a guardian angel looking after her. Betty thrived under this protection. She finished elementary school at the top of her class, her teachers amazed by her intelligence and determination. She joined the church choir at St. Agnes Cathedral, where her voice became the centerpiece of every Sunday service. She even learned to play piano, practicing for hours on the old upright in Mrs. O'Malley's parlor. But perhaps most importantly, she never forgot that night on State Street, and she never stopped feeling the warmth of knowing someone powerful cared whether she succeeded or failed. Years passed. Betty grew from a frightened 12-year-old into a confident young woman. Al Capone's empire faced increasing pressure from federal investigators and rival gangs, but his quiet support for Betty never wavered. Even when he was dealing with tax evasion charges and the constant threat of assassination, envelopes still arrived at Mrs. O'Malley's boarding house. In 1942, when Betty was 23 and had become the lead soloist at one of Chicago's most prestigious churches, she received an unexpected visitor. Frank Rio, older now and bearing the weight of years spent protecting dangerous men, appeared at her door with an envelope that was different from all the others. "Miss Betty," he said, his voice heavy with emotion, "Al wanted me to give this to you personally." Inside was a deed to a small house in a good neighborhood, fully paid for, along with a letter in Al's familiar handwriting. "Dear Betty, by the time you read this, I'll probably be gone. The government finally caught up with me, and I'm heading to Atlanta Federal Penitentiary. I don't know if I'll ever see Chicago again, but I needed to make sure you'd always have a home. You kept your end of our deal. You never stopped singing, and your voice brought beauty into a world that desperately needed it. I kept mine too, but more than that, you gave me something I didn't know I was missing. You reminded me that there's still goodness in this world, even in the darkest corners of Chicago. Keep singing, sweetheart. The world needs angels more than it needs gangsters. Your friend always, Al." Betty held that letter and cried for the man who'd been more of a father to her than anyone else in her life. She understood, perhaps better than anyone, that Al Capone had been capable of both terrible violence and unexpected tenderness, and she'd been blessed to know only the latter. Betty Novak lived to be 91 years old. She married a good man, raised 4 children, and became one of Chicago's most beloved music teachers. But every December 3rd, without fail, she would return to the corner of 22nd and State Street. She would stand there for a few minutes, sometimes humming Amazing Grace softly to herself, remembering the night when Chicago's most dangerous man chose kindness over fear and became the father she'd lost. Her children and grandchildren heard the story countless times, though most thought it was just family legend. But Betty knew what she had experienced. She had the letters, carefully preserved in a wooden box. She had the memories of a man's voice, surprisingly gentle and true, harmonizing with hers on a night when the whole world seemed frozen solid. The story of Al Capone and Betty Novak reminds us that people are more complex than their reputations suggest, that power isn't always about fear and control, that sometimes real strength is knowing when to set aside everything that makes you dangerous and simply be human. On that December night in 1931, Al Capone could have walked past the singing girl. Instead, he stopped, listened, and chose to create something beautiful. In doing so, he didn't just save one child's life. He proved that redemption is possible, even in the darkest places, even for the most unlikely people. That's the kind of legacy that outlasts headlines and police reports. That's the kind of power that changes lives across generations. And that's the kind of story that reminds us that everyone has the capacity for unexpected grace.